Hello again and welcome. Thank you to those of you who are staying with us strong from the last great panel about the county poor farms, and those who are just joining for our next panel entitled Documenting Our Civil Rights Stories. For those of you who are just joining us or maybe are not familiar, I'm Nora Salas, and I'm the director of the Kutsche Office of Local History based here at Grand Valley State University. And our mission is to give voice to diverse communities through history. This next panel looks especially at two African American communities' attempts to do just that, coming from Grand Rapids and Muskegon, respectively. Although the projects discussed are different in their output, one focusing on a documentary film and the other on historic preservation, both are concerned with ensuring that our West Michigan history is inclusive of the Black freedom struggle as it unfolded locally. Lastly, I would like to say before I introduce the panelists that despite some recent and well-known attacks on lifting up the narratives of African Americans we have seen in our country over the past year, we here at the Kutsche office are proud to affirm that Black history is American history and that the American story cannot be separated from neither the pain, promise, or the power of the African American community. Each panelist will have about 15 to 20 minutes to speak, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience or from myself if there's time. And I just want to remind everybody that I will be coming around with a microphone for people to ask their questions, and I want to really encourage you to wait for the mic. People did a great job of that in the last panel. To ask your question, because this really ensures that the most widest range of people can hear your question, and also that the question can be heard on the video of the event. So next, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We'll begin in just a moment with Rodney Brown, who is the producer and founding member of Grandstand Pictures, as well as president of Grand Rapids Media and Film Incubator. Brown and these organizations record and share the stories of Grand Rapids while cultivating the next generation of filmmakers and documentarians in West Michigan. One of his biggest current projects involves turning Todd Robinson's 2013 book, A City Within a City, The Black Freedom Struggle in Grand Rapids, into a documentary. Following that, we will have Katie Kolokithas. I knew I was going to do this, Katie. Katie Kolokithas, who is the survey coordinator for the Michigan State Historic Preservation Office. Her work involves training and providing hands-on assistance for communities and nonprofits seeking to conduct historic resource surveys, including work on the Architectural Survey of African American Civil Rights Resources in Muskegon County project. And then we'll have Pastor Melvin Burns II, a community member working with the Architectural Survey of African American Civil Rights Resources in Muskegon County. He has spent more than 20 years in local and state government and co-hosts a weekly news and information program, and is currently the co-pastor of City Heart Ministries. So without much further ado, I would like to bring our first panelist.
So I know I have 20 minutes. And I don't know exactly how I'm gonna go through this PowerPoint or to share with you what we've discovered in our journey to make the film A City Within a City. I will say this, that I learned the term rabbit trail. So for anyone that considers himself a historian, a researcher, professional historian or otherwise, you'd understand what I mean by this rabbit trail. And it's almost by the day that we discover, and I particularly discover more about this journey of stories that are untold, that are unknown, that are very important, very, very, very important in terms of the narrative. When we talk about language, when we talk about the iconography and the importance of pictures and images and words, and we connect the civil rights struggle to the Black freedom struggle, we've discovered within this narrative clear connections to the national civil rights story right here in Grand Rapids itself. Some of the most amazing things that we've unpacked. Just by way of background, just a little bit about myself, and I don't know if I have that picture, but I wanted to show a picture when I was 8 years old. And I usually will use this picture to kind of background me and say a little bit about myself, because it was when I was probably the most curious. And I still hold this curiosity. But I just know at that time, growing up in Southeast Grand Rapids and seeing things and learning things and sometimes being exposed to things that I didn't have any rightful place being exposed to as an 8-year-old, but I was most curious and most precocious, if you will. And so I'm going to take back to that a tie-in to history and then bring it back to the present. So for me, born and raised in Southeast Grand Rapids on Lafayette and Hall, having attended Vandenberg Elementary School, a follow-through program that was put in place by the president at that time, our very own Gerald R. Ford. In a building, I've learned, Vandenberg Elementary School is named after an iconic West Michigan former Senator, Arthur Vandenberg. Let me fast forward. When we start to connect these stories in our book, A City Within a City, even with those two gentlemen, it's some of the most incredible history for those who are interested in politics, systems, justice, some of the most incredible connections here. So that's some of the rabbit trailing. I was lucky to be able to leave Grand Rapids and go off to college in California, in the Bay Area, one of the greatest places on earth, next to Grand Rapids. No, Grand Rapids doesn't compare to the Bay Area, to be clear. When you talk about rich, cultural, intellectual, academic diversity, oh, it's a place that we should aspire to appreciate. And I know my being in the Bay Area, I went to Santa Clara University, a private Jesuit college in the Bay Area. I even learned about Jesus different than how we learn about Jesus in West Michigan, if you know anything about Jesuits in the education system. Exactly. So the time that I spent in California, I started teaching 7th grade in East Palo Alto, California. Here's a movie reference. That right as I got out of college, and I was in a classroom as a substitute teacher, and at that time, I was the 7th teacher that year in the classroom. And my degree was in political science. I wasn't trained as an educator per se. I had that curiosity, certainly. I had structure and such. I was a college athlete. I'd be remiss, let me say this, the keynote speaker, Dr. Delia Fernandez, I'm so grateful to be able to be here and hear her story and to listen to her research. I want to give a shout out to her, and I'll probably do it again, being a Red Hawk myself. We're graduates both of Union High School. But making these connections, I'm a real linear sort of thinker about these connections. But nonetheless, the 7th teacher this year in the classroom, you may remember the movie Dangerous Minds with Michelle Pfeiffer. I'm gonna give you some movie references. Anybody remember that movie, Dangerous Minds? This is the school district that she taught in East Palo Alto. This is early 90s or so. I spent a year there, and then I pined to get back home. I wanted to come back home. So I come back home, get involved in community, and then over the years I did entertainment things and have been an educator now, 25 years here in Grand Rapids, having been an adjunct professor of political science at Grand Rapids Community College, and currently I'm a high school principal. And so I came back to Grand Rapids to get involved in community, empower my community, if you will, make a difference in my community. And one of the things that I recognize is that entertainment is a really important component of community. So I got involved in entertainment. Fast forward maybe to about 2008 or so, although we did promotions, this, that, and the other, I started thinking about making movies. And so here's another tie-in. I didn't realize this until that time that my uncle, who I say discovered the one of greatest soul singing legends that comes from Grand Rapids, the Reverend Al Green, by writing his first #1 single and putting him in a band called Al Green and the Creations. He changed the name of his band, the Soulmates. This is in the early 60s. And we're gonna do a movie on that as well. But what I recognize is that with that, my entertainment connections, this vision and importance of stories in terms of framing narratives, we're gonna get into the slides real quick in terms of the organization we started called the Grand Rapids Media Initiative and Film Incubator, where we lift up issues of media literacy, narrative justice, and equity advocacy through storytelling in film. And so, although A City Within a City is my first film production, is my partner Jasmine Fuentes, another partner Victor Williams, who couldn't be here with us. We have a production company that's producing the A City Within a City film. We own the intellectual property as an organization, GR MiFi, through the book A City Within a City. But we employ strategies that are fairly comprehensive around storytelling, whereby we lift up Black stories in stories in Grand Rapids, whereby we can help to overcome insidious, let's add, institutional and structural racism in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Our author calls it, if you all are familiar in the book, I'm curious, who all is familiar with A City Within a City book? Exactly. Our author, Dr. Robinson, calls this insidious, structural, institutional racism a more kinder, more gentler, a more West Michigan nice term, if you will. But he calls it managerial racism. And we'll get into that, but that's some of our mission there. This gentleman here, Mr. Carl Smith, is one of the most significant to me, one of my favorite individuals all time, is a mentor, personal mentor of mine throughout my life. Goes back to when I was a kid. I can give you other stories. But Mr. Smith taught me especially about the power to define and determine. He was a local publisher of a newspaper called the Organizer newspaper. And so through my middle school and high school years, I used to spend time with Mr. Smith in his newspaper. It was a community organizer newspaper. But taught me, thus I then share with community and see that we understand this, that those that have the power to define have the power to determine. So let's just go back again to this idea around the iconography and the things that we see every day in our community, and then we recognize this deficiency, if you will, in things that we don't see that are diverse. I can get into some of the iconography we've seen in recent years with murals and other things that we see in town. Those things are important. are critically important. And it's something that happens all over the country relative to murals and such. Mr. Smith has a mural with some others where he, right on Division Street. It's an incredible mural. All right, so some of our sponsors and donors, well, I'd be remiss if we didn't share to support our film. You see that. Really want to lift up the Steelcase Foundation and Rob Pugh and Kate Pugh Walters. But the others who are supporting our project, just want to give them some acknowledgments. Our content partners with the film, there's some there. Big shout out to Mr. Bayard, George Bayard with the Grand Rapids African American Museum and Archives, who has worked with us and has been a great resource, and certainly the Grand Rapids Public Library. That's where I learned the term rabbit trailing and this term around that Dr. Randall Jelks, who's an associate producer with us on the film, who wrote the book, the first book about the African American freedom struggle, if you will, in Grand Rapids, called African Americans in the Furniture City. You all, I'm sure, are mostly aware if you're not. Our Grandstand Pictures team, again, although we are in our 5th year of production, that's a whole thing. I'd love to take a question or two about our production process and what we've learned. We didn't actually start shooting until last year in 2022. And it took us 2 years just to do development on our project. That's our team there. Ms. Kimberly Williams is also an associate producer with us, 2 of our creators there. One day you're gonna have to listen to, lastly I'll just share one of our content partners, Ms. Shannon Jamal Holloman's, and when we talk about placemaking in Grand Rapids, we actually are sponsoring a tour of the Oakdale Cemetery. Keep your eyes and ears open for this tour, and just undiscovered stories and jewels that we're finding on this trail. And so keep your eyes open for that. We've done that with her and support Shannon, Pastor Shannon, on that tour. I'd love to take questions on the film, kind of where we are, prominent stories. We are doing a 90-minute full-length documentary based on the book, Dr. Todd Robinson. We're so grateful he chose our team over about 7 or 8 different individuals. We have avoided maybe 7 or 8 coup attempts to try to stop us from telling our story. I say that in jest, but in all seriousness, there's some people who don't want to hear these stories. With that being said, thank you for having me. Big shout out to the team at Kutsche, and Mary, thank you so much for getting us together. Thank you, Mary.
Good afternoon. My name is Katie Kolokithas. I'm the survey coordinator at the Michigan State Historic Preservation Office. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the SHPO, as we affectionately call it, but it is a state agency located in Lansing. Every single state in the country has one. We've been around since about 1967. The year after the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 passed. I actually just was at the archives last week trying to figure out who our very first SHPO was, and I think I figured it out. So we are the state office and agency that is in charge of documenting historic structures. We run a number, I think we have 12 different programs, everything from archaeology to historic tax credits to my survey program. We also administer the National Register of Historic Places programs, and we assist local communities with local historic districts. So preservation has a very kind of specific role in history, and we are, because of that, we have some constraints on what we do and don't do. So our office for the last at least the last decade or so, has been like laser focused on trying to increase representation for a variety of underrepresented communities on the National Register. So in 2016, we finally had some funding opportunities and were able to go through and apply for a National Park Service African American Civil Rights Grant. And we conducted a very large survey in the city of Detroit on their civil rights sites. And that project has spurred, I want to say an additional 6 or 7 National Park Service grants, either through our office, nonprofits in the city, and also the city of Detroit themselves have applied for a number of those grants and been awarded those to identify and document some of these neighborhoods. That project wrapped up in 2018, and we were starting to kind of think about and consider what our next options were going to be, and we decided that we wanted to try to shift and go towards looking at somewhere in West Michigan. After a number of conversations with our partners in local communities across West Michigan, we kind of narrowed down to Muskegon. We considered Grand Rapids. There was a lot going on there as well, but we have a lot of survey documentation information for Grand Rapids, and we have almost nothing for Muskegon. So we decided to focus in on Muskegon. Muskegon also has a very active community that is working very hard to document civil rights, but it was mostly focused on oral histories and not a lot of tying that to physical places, which is what we obviously do. Grand Rapids, or the city of Muskegon's last survey that they did, which was done in 1970, and it focused exclusively on lumber baron mansions, as you can probably imagine. So there's a number of them there, but that doesn't give us much information to go on. And we started this project with an application to the National Park Service in 2019. We were awarded the grant in, I want to say, the second or third week of March of 2020, which I'm sure you can all imagine how that went. I think we were home, and I think I got a voicemail and had to go to my office, which was highly not okay at that point, and get the message from my office phone, because we did not have cell phones at that point. So that was an interesting start to the project, but slowly over the last 3 years, we've been working to build a team that can help us have a really great project and a really great effort. We were able to make connections with the Muskegon County Intermediate School District, and then also the Coalition for Community Development and the Lakeshore Museum, who have been working on, along with the NAACP chapter, have been working on toolkits that were part of the Lakeshore Museum's collection, and those are available for teachers and homeschool families and students, and they can pull those toolkits, and they have a variety of curriculum information related to civil rights. So we, in partnership with them, decided that we were going to add that as kind of an additional piece to the survey. Historic resource surveys are kind of a unique thing. They are basically a inventory of important historic structures and sites. We have to, for our type of history, we have to have a place. It's one of the limitations, because sometimes there aren't places left. And Muskegon, in particular, had a lot of urban renewal and changes that have been made to the city, and there are a lot of places that are gone that have a very important history, but we are trying to focus in on the ones that are still remaining and left. I think we've got about 65 on the current study list that we've collected from oral histories and historic research at the library and other local repositories. So the toolkit piece will be, they're actually meeting about it. I don't even know what time it is. They're meeting about it right now. They are working on a story map that the school district is going to host, and students and teachers will actively participate and add sites to this story map and be able to interact with that. And we hope that it will be a useful tool in the future and something that people can add to and experience. If you're not familiar with the story map, it's a GIS-based web program where you can tie history and photos to a place on a map. And at one point, there was a really nice one for the city of Grand Rapids related to civil rights history, and I haven't been able to find it recently. I don't know if anyone knows what happened to it. But when I was applying for the Muskegon grant, there was a really great one for the city of Grand Rapids that has since disappeared into the ether. So if anybody can find it, let me know. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at. The types of sites that we look at are hugely variable. We look at everything from private residences to commercial buildings to churches to schools. It really just depends. We were hoping at the start of the project that we would be able to find some untold stories from the more rural areas of Muskegon County, because the project does cover the entire county. That hasn't materialized as much as we were hoping, but I think we just, in the last few weeks, our contractor that works on the project was able to identify some sites in Norton Shores and some of the other kind of outside of Muskegon and Muskegon Heights that we are starting to look at as well. Just to give you a couple of examples of the types of buildings that we look at, this is now Reich's Bakery Cafe, which is delicious if you haven't been. One of the benefits of survey work is that you can go and get some treats when you find a restaurant or a bakery in one of your buildings. But this was the former Sanitary Dairy Company building. They were the scene of a very large boycott because of their inequitable hiring practices that eventually was successful, and they were able to make some improvements. Another one that we're working on right now is Marsh Field. Marsh Field is still there. It's a baseball stadium still. This one is interesting though because the historic stands that you see in this photo are not there anymore. There's a historic marker, Michigan historic marker there still, and we are documenting it as part of the survey, but it will be obviously not eligible for inclusion in the National Register because there's not the historic structures left. So that eligibility for the National Register is what we kind of have to live and die by in terms of our level of what rises above and what doesn't. Which obviously has some, like I've said, has some limitations. The benefit to us going through and figuring out what is eligible and what is not eligible for the National Register is that we also administer the federal compliance reviews under what's called Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which any federally funded project in the whole country has to go through a review process. Anything in Michigan obviously goes through our office. And we have to look at whether or not a project is going to impact historic structures. And it's things that we know about. So if we don't know about something, we're kind of in the dark on being able to say, hey, that project's going to have a huge impact on this neighborhood. The laws got passed in response to a lot of that urban renewal activity that happened in the 60s and even before. There's definitely some challenges. One of the reasons that we're so actively trying to identify sites in a broad area of the state is just that we want to know where these are. We want to know we don't want to miss things. So it's a really important part of things, even if it's the kind of technical side of things. So like I said, just home. This is the home of Rilistine Wilkins, who's a recently retired longtime county commissioner. She's been gracious enough to do some oral history work with our contractor as well, but her home is included. Apollo Lounge, we found some other kind of recreation-based sites as well. And, the other benefit of our office is that we have been able to make a difference in terms of kind of saving and preserving structures that a good example is in the City of Detroit project. During the course of that survey, we were able to identify a building called Vaughn's Bookstore, which was a highly influential bookstore in the City of Detroit. And everyone, at least at the city level, had kind of forgot where it was. And it was actually on the demolition list for the land bank. And because of the survey, they were able to say, hold on a second, we need to do something about this. So they pulled the bookstore off of the demo list. And then we were able to apply for a National Park Service grant to get it listed on the National Register, which will open up funding opportunities and historic tax credits. And as well as grant opportunities for whoever they are able to market that building to. So we're hoping that that kind of momentum that we found in Detroit follows through and continues on in Muskegon. And our newest project is in Niles, Michigan as well. We're conducting our just kicking off a survey of the Ferry Street neighborhood in Niles, which is home to an African-American neighborhood from very early on. I'm going to forget dates, but I think it's pre-Civil War, if I remember correctly. So there's there's a school building and some churches and residences, and I believe a Freemason hall in that neighborhood that we're working on documenting. And that project is literally kicking off in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So we as an office are committed to kind of finding places that we can use these grant funding for. The federal government has provided an enormous amount of money for these types of projects across the country. I think for next year, they have $17 million for the civil rights grants. And those are open to SHPO offices, city governments, certified local governments, which is another designation that is kind of a partnership between our office and the Park Service. as well as sometimes they're open to nonprofits as well. And they fund not only documentation projects like what we're doing here, but also rehab projects. There's a very large project in Detroit again that was spurred from that grant, that original grant. That's a $500,000 grant to fix a roof on a very, very, very important church in Detroit. So we're hoping that as we finish up Muskegon, things will kind of spur some additional momentum in terms of development or tax credits. That's always our hope. But having these sites identified and in our inventory will really help us as well when we're making those important decisions about federally funded projects. We actually had I'm reviewing another survey right now for a project in Muskegon that's going to overlap a lot of our sites that we're looking at. And now I have all that information and I can take that into account when I'm reviewing that project. So it really helps us as well. That is Dr. James Jackson's medical office. And he was a highly influential civil rights activist, and he also was his name is on the Civil Rights Museum in Muskegon. The way that our projects work too is that you've heard me reference a contractor. We don't have the capacity to do the work ourselves as much as I would love to. So we often hire professional consultants that will do that work for us. Muskegon, I've got to be more involved probably than we typically are just because of COVID. It has made things very, very, very difficult to get things done and have people be willing to meet with us just for fear of getting sick. And we've also had a number of individuals die during the process of this. So it's kind of that we're in that sweet spot of like wanting to capture a lot of those oral histories and before those folks are gone. So we're hoping that will continue on. And the city of Muskegon and Muskegon Heights and all kind of the Muskegon community in general has done a really excellent job with a number of art exhibits and other things regarding civil rights. So we were hoping to build on that. The last one of the more recent things, our rule of thumb, and you may or may not have heard this, but we look at history that is 50 years old or older. We like to tease our colleagues as they become 50 that now you're eligible for the National Register. So we are limited by the National Park Service and the federal government to looking at things that are 50 years old or older. But sometimes we have things that are really important that are not 50 years old yet, and this is one of them. This is a local real estate agent's office. She was the first African-American broker in West Michigan, but I think this office and her tenure in it dates to the late 70s, so we're not 50 years old yet. So we handle this by documenting the history in our survey report and indicating in there that, hey, this may not be eligible right now, but the second it turns 50 years old, you better believe it's going to be eligible. So when we're reviewing projects, we would still probably treat this as eligible just because it's so close at this point in time. But we're limited to generally to things that are 50 years old and older. The Park Service has also relaxed a lot on how much we rely on something that we know as integrity. That's been it was a very big sticking point for a long time in preservation because and it's one of the reasons that there is such a gap in representation across a variety of ethnic groups and women, sites related to women, and just because of the nature of the way that things are. We were looking, preservation got its roots in looking at things that were high style and built by architects and fancy and pretty, and we do not do that anymore. So the field in general has really shifted in the last 2 decades or so and is really working to kind of correct some of those earlier mistakes. So a lot of the buildings that we look at now are very humble but they have a really important story to tell, and we think it's important to tie that history to a place. So I think that's about all I've got.
Life takes you in funny circles. I first got on the committee looking in Muskegon County because my boss said, I don't have time once you join this committee. And I was doing some contract work at the city, and once I saw what it was about, I was like, well, yeah, I'm kind of interested in civil rights history in Muskegon County. I need to tell you, I'm a native son of Muskegon County, born and raised in the city of Muskegon Heights. And if you know anything about Muskegon County, that is where the largest concentration of African Americans in the county is in Muskegon Heights. And first generation from this. My parents were both born and raised in the South and moved here later in life. And so being on the committee, I've been thinking about this the last few days. I talk all the time, but I don't often talk about history, and having been on the committee and some of the challenges they've had with finding places. And you think about civil rights history, and I've thought about this even driving up today. You know, in our day, we romanticize a lot of things about history. You know, people go sit on, reenact Civil War battles and, they enjoy those things. And when you think about civil rights history, to even think about it now, my daughter went to a march maybe 2 years ago, and I remember talking to her about it beforehand, but it's a little bit romanticized. When you think about the history of civil rights, is most of the people you talk to, and you talk to people in their 90s, and they do this thing where after a while they just kind of stare into space. And they say something like, I thank God that we made it through. So it's not really pleasant. We're thinking about these places, and I've thought about this, and most of the places where these events occur, like a sanitary dairy, they don't bring back pleasant memories. And so I think that's why, and I've worked in state and local government most of my life, I think that's why in communities like ours, there's not this big thought of, let's preserve this place, because the memories just aren't that good. And so let me just tell you again, I'm a native son of Muskegon Heights, born and raised there. I moved back there in 1994, spent 12 years in local government, left for about 16 years and pastored a church in the same community and returned currently, again, as the interim city manager of Muskegon Heights. I kind of see this idea of civil rights history through my father's eyes. My father, again, born in the South, served in World War II, was on his way to California with his two brothers. Stopped in Muskegon, checked on his uncle, got a job the next day. Next thing you know, he's working 40-something years in a factory in Muskegon. But the same man also, and again, one of the founders of the Urban League in Muskegon County, was involved in the union, trained Golden Glove boxers. And so I saw this, as a kid born in '62, I sort of saw life through his eyes and his actions and my parents. And so when you talk about, I can remember boycotting downtown Muskegon Heights. I don't remember the sanitary dairy, but it was certain stores we don't go to, and don't go to this neighborhood. When my father passed, they were the first black family on their block, and there was a kid who was there when my father passed. He came to the funeral. He just said, I remember your family was the first black family in our neighborhood. And that was a big deal. And so I've sort of grown up looking at history and seeing history through the things I heard him say and the things I heard more really after he passed. And so in my lifetime, and I saw this, I can remember not just hearing stories, but talking to the first black student in Muskegon and Muskegon Heights high schools, the first black doctor to come to Muskegon. These are people that I've met and talked to in a lifetime, and those were just those people. I was just thinking the other day in my community, Muskegon Heights, the first black firefighter. And when I started working with him, he didn't tell stories about it. He just, he was a chief at that time, but, and in fact, the only story he really shared was when he started working, none of the guys would share a bunk with him when they'd rotate shifts. And the assistant chief at the time was the first person, was like, hey, I'm tired, we're gonna share, we're gonna switch bunks. But not a lot of stories about what those early days were like in the fire department. He didn't talk about them. And so it's this challenge of where these places and things happen. And again, through the being involved on the community survey, again, we find a lot of the churches are still there where people met. There's some of these churches, but a lot of the places, the stories are very much alive. And when you hear the same story repeated by 5, 6, 7 people, almost identical. People never tell the story the same way. They add parts to it. But when you hear these same stories and you go, oh, okay, so that's where that happened. But again, it wasn't so much the places, it was the people that did the things. You go, oh, well, that's where that took place. Part of our community on the west side where there were certain places, again, where only the African American people live. So when you hear these stories, you go, oh, so that's where that is now. But we didn't put the connection to, these might be really important places one day or important stories, because I think we were trying to get away from that a little bit. So by growing up in the community, you hear stories about the churches where the NAACP and the Urban League met and how significant that was, or the stories about pastors who tried to buy churches and the white neighbors didn't want them to buy the church. Or getting the first students at elementary schools and high schools, and the things they went, the challenges they went through were, my father was a union worker. And so ironically, there were two very large factories at the time. And my attorney later, years later, told me that his father and his uncle were the personnel directors at these two factories. And the role that the unions played in dealing with some of the employment issues, and if you don't hire, they wouldn't hire certain black people for certain jobs in the factories. You might do some of the more dangerous manual labor, but there were certain jobs you didn't do. And so you find out there are people in the community who weren't just involved in the unions, but you start to find out that, again, I was born in '62, that there was this thing going on in the country that got called the Civil Rights Movement. And so you start to find out that there are people in your community who were also tied to this bigger thing going on. And you don't know this when you're a kid growing up, but you come to find out that there were people in your community, and as I found out later, people in my own house called Dad, who were going around the country organizing labor unions and bringing that same knowledge back home. Or there were people being involved in the NAACP and national marches that were coming back home saying, these are the same things we have to do here in Muskegon County and Muskegon Heights. And so that sort of became my connection, understanding of the significance of those things. My dad used to always quote a poem by Langston Hughes called I Dream a World. And I just thought it was cool that he was old and could remember a poem. But when I think about it now, then since I am old, and I think about it more in context now, that there were really people that I grew up with. They were my teachers. There was one of the people we've had a chance to talk to during the survey was a friend of my dad's who was 93 or 94 at the end of this month. And they were really trying to change the world. They were trying to change the world, and in these schools and having, the nightclub they showed, and I know the history of the last 50 years, and it wasn't the place to go, and then people stopped going there, but it was the only place to go for a while. Mr. Brown talked about Al Green, and Muskegon likes to claim it because he had a lot of family to move to Muskegon, but you realize these people came through there because even though they may begin to become known, especially in the 60s and 70s, but they had family. And when they came to Muskegon, some place like the Occidental Motel, where you could work there, but you couldn't stay there and have guests. And so there became a point when people say, well, we're not going there anymore, or we're not going to the State Theater anymore. So you have all these things happening. Again, growing up, I don't know how a kid 7 or 8 sees, oh, this is part of the same thing that's going on when you watch these things on TV, but it was the same thing going on. And so again, understanding the challenge I have now trying to find the places where these things happen, because again, a lot of them just don't exist. Or yeah, this is the place where this happened, but nothing is still there to remind you except all the stories that people tell. So I'm excited to be on the committee because I'm hoping we can overcome the challenge of tying the stories that are still alive with the people, and some are still here, and the struggles and the fights they went through to again try to make it a better world. I'm not sure how long I've been rambling on, but I'm gonna wrap up. Just again, I was thinking about this project and what it's supposed to leave behind. I mentioned a couple of years, maybe 2 years ago, my daughter went to a march, and I remember sitting down talking to her. I was like, well, why do you want to do this? What's the point? And she explained it to me because she needed my permission to go. And so what I wanted to know is, why is this important to you? Why do you think you need to go out here? It could be slightly dangerous. I wasn't going. I'm old now. I wasn't going to go out there and walk. But I wanted to know why it was important and why it mattered, because I didn't want it to just be a show. Then I talked to her about my experience at marches and then her family history related to it, because it needed to mean something. And so it's important, one, that we document these places, but again, they need to be passed down to a generation that my daughter's 23. She sees the world totally different than I do, completely different. But I want her and her friends and her generation to have an appreciation for what took place, where these things took place, and maybe do a little better job of maintaining their integrity, understanding they're important, and then passing those stories down. So I think it helps them know where they want to go. So I'm hoping, again, we do a little better job of preserving some of these places in the future. Again, we may, and talking to a few people that still around, still find another gym in Muskegon that we hadn't encountered before. But I'm really appreciative of accidentally ending up on this committee, and again, being able to just even recount some of the stories I grew up hearing. And even I've learned, again, I heard these stories but didn't know where they took place. And so I've been very appreciative of even sort of relearning the history and the struggle that's sort of taking place in Muskegon County.
So now I'm going to come down, and I'd love to hear some of your questions for the panelists.
I've been doing a lot of research on Michigan places in the Green Book, and if I should have checked before I came, but I think there were 3 places, possibly 4. Are any of those still standing in Muskegon?
Is mine on? Can you hear me? Okay. I think there's 3 in the one that I've looked at, and I believe at least 2 of them are still standing and are included in the survey.
Okay.
They're private homes. So
Right, because they were originally private homes too.
Yep.
And in Grand Rapids, we have, in our city assessor's office, we have photos from mostly 1936 that were part of a FHA program that they hired WPA photographers to go and photograph all the structures in the city. Does Muskegon have anything like that?
Not that I've encountered. Yeah, not that we've encountered. Our biggest challenge lately has been the Housing Commission's records are apparently just completely MIA. That's been a challenge, but that's pretty common. We're used to dealing with that. We rely a lot on Sanborn fire insurance maps to help us kind of date buildings. We also rely heavily on things like city directories and newspaper accounts of the time. It just kind of varies, but we're used to there being big gaps in the record, unfortunately.
I think George Baird. Oh, you have the map, don't you? That they're looking for. You talked about the Grand Rapids map that shows sites. It's a walking tour map that's available at the museum still, isn't it? Yeah. So I think is that what you're looking at?
It was a GIS based, like an online GIS based platform, but this was in like probably mid 2019, so it may have disappeared. I couldn't figure out at that time who was hosting it, like what organization had created it.
Well, you definitely might want to check out that at the African American Museum. Yeah.
Okay.
Grandma.
Katie, we should talk after this, but I wonder if it's actually one of my colleagues, Lewis Moore, who did a lot of story map projects on African American history with his students. So, and they could have come down. You know, that's the thing with online.
Yeah, for sure.
So it can happen. All right, thank you. Other questions? It's great to connect people with resources too.
Much of the Black history in the Muskegon, I'm an old Muskegon person, is not focused on structures, but on movements, on places. And Muskegon truly has a unique migration history. Is that being recorded and preserved in any way?
It is. So the survey report includes a very extensive historic context at the front of it. So it will cover a variety of topics, including that early development history and where folks were coming from and moving to. And so that will all be covered. And that will eventually, we are extending the project slightly. We were supposed to be done in August of this year, but we are extending it to January just because of some new information that just kind of came up and we want to explore a little further. But probably in, I would guess February of next year, the report will be available for sure on our website. We have a whole civil rights an underrepresented communities section of our website that has the Detroit survey that we talked about. We also have one ongoing right now in Inkster that's specifically housing related. And then those other two, the Muskegon and the Niles that I mentioned as well. So we're kind of slowly building that out as these projects wrap up.
There's also I want to call it up from the bottom. So there's at the Lakeshore Museum, maybe 15 years ago, they did put together a video that kind of talks about that oral history of migration from the South. It's maybe about a 60-minute long video. It's pretty good.
Yeah, it's was a Michigan Humanities Council grant, I think, that the Lakeshore Museum got, and I don't remember where we got a copy of it, but I don't think, it might be even online.
I think it is.
But it's a nice documentary, and it does cover that extensively. So.
Thank you. All right. I think there was another question.
Hello. My name is Andy Schleiwitz. I teach at Grand Valley and courses on history of global transformation and Latina studies. A lot of it has history. And so one thing I was thinking or wondering is how you talked about generational differences and just how you see the world. And
Yes.
so, and then you're into movie making and storytelling. And then storytelling is a part of preservation. So how would you each have one thing you would say, okay, if you're going to talk to 18 to 22-year-olds or that area, present the history you think is important, what's one thing you should keep in mind in talking to that age group? Does that make sense?
I think so. I think for me, I think it like growing up and learning about this era of history, it felt like a really long time ago. And I think that for a lot of young people, it feels like a really long time ago. And then at some point, a couple of months ago, someone either in our office or somewhere mentioned that I think Ruby Brown is like 62. And it just never, I don't know, it never connected in my head that, oh my gosh, that really wasn't that long ago. And I remember, learning and taking classes in my graduate degrees where we talked about interracial marriage and like when that actually got outlawed and like that, it just feels like a long time ago. So I think making sure that people understand that it really wasn't that long ago. There are there are millions of people across the country that are still alive that lived this. And I think that making that connection can help young people kind of understand like, oh, wow, okay, this wasn't that long ago.
Probably the thing I try to get across the most is the change in the cost for it. I realize now how much our parents shielded us from the world so we could just be normal kids, whatever that is. But then when you go to the park, you interact with kids and you know things, you know what race is and you know there's places you shouldn't go. So for my daughter, her friends that want to change the world, I always want to make them know there's going to be a cost. You got to give up something. It's going to cost you something if you want things to be different. And I try to share historically what it may have cost people in your family, people you know, to have some of the things you have now.
So when Mr. Burns was speaking and he makes the point of these stories needing to be passed on, that's the motivation that we have for wanting to make the film. So those who are familiar with the book knows it's a dense read. Certainly it was some research that Dr. Robinson had put together here in Grand Rapids. And as compelling as the story was, young people wouldn't see it relevant. Most people wouldn't see it as relevant. So how do we make stories relevant to young people? And that changes. One of the things that we're focused on is that our documentary won't be necessarily a sit and get sort of documentary, although it's traditional in the sense that we have sit-down interviews for sure. Some incredible interviews we've already done with some others that we plan to do. We just spent, I'd say, 2 hours on a phone call yesterday trying to figure out how do we utilize animation in our film, because young people are interested in animation. So just, again, making stories relevant to young people, and it changes all the time in terms, especially the platforms that they use. It's really now for young people short content, like with these, YouTubes and Twitters and those things. So some of the things that we're doing include some vignettes that we're going to try to lift up short stories as well, that we hope will pull younger people in to want to see a full-length documentary film. So I hope that answers that question, but just relevance. How do we make it relevant? Young people, if you leave it to them, I have a daughter who's in college right now, and again, I work with young people every day, and have to encourage them that it's a continuum, and things didn't start with them, So often young people think that history starts with them. I mean, relative to Grand Rapids, I'll say this lastly, we saw a different level of activism in Grand Rapids that we'd never seen before after the Patrick Lyoya murder. And a lot of young people got involved in community organizing and politics since then, and don't have, real reference to the Rodney King beating and or other police issues of brutality. But social media, certainly since George Floyd and others, and the way that the internet has promoted these issues, it's kind of helped. I call them the microwave generation. They kind of want everything now, real fast, and in a hurry. And history is not that. It's incumbent upon us all to try to make it relevant.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. While you're going to that other question, I will lift up with Dr. Bayard, Mr. Bayard here, a project that we're doing similar to when you were talking about Story Map History Pen, where we're doing an oral history with the South High School story, really prominent in our book. So we partnered with the Grand Rapids African American Museum and Archives to do an oral history project, and you can find it at History Pen. We're still developing this right now.
Thank you. And our videographer would like to ask that everybody bring the microphones closer to them when they're speaking. Thank you.
I wanted to ask if the targeted money that you have for the different places around Michigan, does that eliminate projects like in Grand Rapids, or we can still come to you?
No, not at all. Grand Rapids is a certified local government as well, so they are able to apply. Our office has very limited funds at this point that we can give out. We are required to pass through about 10% of what we receive from the federal government to those certified local governments. So they can apply for grants on an annual cycle. Rhonda Baker is the contact at the city of Grand Rapids. We are always looking for and interested in talking to folks who have projects that they want to be, that they're interested in funding. We have fairly limited capacity just because we're a fairly small office, but we try, and the NPS grant cycles are 3 years, so they're kind of a long grant cycle. But it certainly does not. It's Grand Rapids is still on our list. It just this time we went with Muskegon, and then we are trying to kind of plan out the next few years of our grant cycles as the 3 or 4 that we have going right now drop off in the next. They'll come. The Inkster one is done at the end of this fiscal year, and then Muskegon will be done in early next year, and then I think that's the majority of the ones we have right this second. So we're kind of starting to plan the next few years of grants that we're going to apply for. So definitely I can give you a business card if you'd like, and we are happy to talk to you, or if anyone has ideas or places that you think we should go. We're absolutely interested in chatting with you. It makes it so much easier. Part of why Muskegon has been such a challenge is because we had to build all those connections. We didn't have a lot of connections already there. They didn't do a lot of preservation over the since that 1970 survey. So we really had to kind of build those connections from scratch. Whereas like in Detroit, we had all that well established. Detroit has almost more historians and architectural historians on their staff than we do as the state agency. So they have a lot more capacity than we do in terms of they're working with one city. We have the whole state. So, but yeah, absolutely. Let's connect after, and I can give you a business card, and happy to chat about it.
The other question is, as historians, we're a museum, you're a filmmaker, you have the project for preservation. We talk about history as most people look at it as back then. That's history back then. But we know that currently there is a blanket CRT over everything. It's scooped up the arts, the humanities, everything, which makes a statement about Black history not being important. Black history, we don't want our kids to learn about Black history. They don't realize, as most people do, that Black history is a part of American history. Can you talk a little bit about that struggle and how what you do will help to overcome that bigger blanket of people trying to fight against the teaching and learning about African American history?
Yeah. So to me, in my interpretation there, Mr. Baird, thank you for that, is that this is why Todd, in his book to me, uses the term managerial racism to describe this deep history of issues of race and geography here in Grand Rapids. And so certainly I've thought through, and we've thought about, would that be considered CRT if we talked about it? And if we were in Florida, probably so. But considering that we're in the great state of Michigan, and considering that Grand Rapids, as it's perceived to be in its system that Todd describes in his book, and even the 2015 Forbes report that talked about Blacks in Grand Rapids being the second worst for economic development, it's really not the community of Grand Rapids and in Michigan. And that speaks to the power of a system that Todd describes that we're unpacking. And I like to say that good people are caught up in a bad system. We're better than what our data tells us. Our community is better, deeply better on so many levels. We won't get caught up in CRT, I don't believe. And even if you look at what happened in an organized way in Ottawa County, in the way that them folks over there organized and took over Ottawa County, that's not gonna happen in Kent County, even though there's a burgeoning sort of effort that parallels that. It's not gonna happen in the state of Michigan. I'm being real hopeful. I can't say it won't. I don't believe people will be successful because I think the good people of Grand Rapids, in spite of their political affiliation, I think our faith in this community won't allow for us. I think our intellectual curiosities won't allow for us to say that we're not going to teach the truth. I don't see it.
From a preservation, from the preservation side of things, we are not seeing any pushback. There's, like I mentioned, a very concerted, huge effort by the Park Service. Even over the last, even from 2016 through 2020, there was a very concerted effort to increase the funding for each of those programs that I mentioned. They currently have 5, I think. They have a tribal heritage grant program. They have the civil rights grant program. They have an underrepresented communities grant program. They have a history of equal rights grant program. And each of those, the budgets for each of those that they're able to give out to states has increased every year for the last 5 years, at least 5 or 6 years. So we, strive to tell the best history that we can tell, and we push our consultants to search out different sources. We still get folks that just want to rely on one type of newspaper, and that's not good enough. So we really try to push people to, tell an honest recounting of history, even when that is painful. But we do get a lot of, preservation is inherently political. we get development pressure, and we get pressure from politicians, and we get all kinds of pressure from a variety of places, and we just try to do the best we can to do the best job that we're all trained to do, and present, the most honest version of history that we can figure out from the various sources, and all of the sources that we find have some inherent bias in them just because of the time period that they were written in, but we try to kind of go in with eyes wide open on that. And but I do find it encouraging that at least there is, despite all of the craziness of the last few years with CRT and the discussions of it, that those grant programs have continued to increase in terms of their budgets. So
I'll say it's a term that I never hear in daily life. I was thinking, the community I'm from, there's a story about that this overcome the civil rights struggles community changes from being primarily white to primarily black. There's another story told in the suburbs around our city that how they thrived in the 60s and 70s, started growing, and they don't know some of the deals that were made to take resources out of our city to cause their cities to prosper. Been in this for a while, so how the transportation system changed to be a disadvantage to our community, advantage to other communities, or how these industrial funds were primarily factories that did extremely well. They created these industrial funds to bring other factories, but then they weren't located in communities where the majority of workers were. And so I think that part of the story is what's now being told. People are starting to understand when they talk about things like, economic disparity and economic justice. But that CRT term just doesn't, it just doesn't get used. Y'all hear it on TV more. And again, kind of like the boogeyman, nobody's really ever seen it. But you hear it on TV, but in daily things, people don't use that term. Maybe in academia, in certain, but it's just not used when we're trying to deal with those issues in real life.
Another term I'll give you is fellow travelers. And so when we started our film, our attorney who represents, production companies from here to Detroit and Chicago and LA, and as we were learning the process, he would just tell us, you're going to meet others who are fellow travelers in this process. I look at history as the same way, and again, I think that we in Grand Rapids, in West Michigan, we're missing an awful lot of history, and that this community, our leadership, quite frankly, for different reasons, and we can chalk some of it up to politics and certainly a term that people don't like to use, but in ways, white supremacy. We can chalk it up, some of that, to that. But the people who are, and I mentioned the murals and such that are going up, it's the same thing that happened in, Oakland, California, and Baltimore, and DC. We're actually on the front end of that while our neighborhoods are still being developed, and we're fighting gentrification throughout the city of Grand Rapids, that there's fellow travelers out there who believe that things should be fair and things should be just, and that they want the truth. And we've not pulled that out fully in this community because our community, from an iconography standpoint, again, don't see it. I grew up believing that you can't be what you can't see. And, that's one of the bigger challenges that we have in Grand Rapids. And people think it's a zero-sum game often, whereby only one group or one group that looks or lives a certain way is the group that deserves opportunity, or the group that deserves to be living through privilege, or systemically should be in control. And there's a lot of fellow travelers that don't believe that. And you're one of them, and I would assume that anyone who's passionate about history and storytelling and truth, regardless of race and gender, that you're a fellow traveler as well. Lastly, let me just say that connected to Muskegon, I know Mr. Burns because I used to be an executive at a nonprofit, Urban League. in Muskegon. And I was sharing with them earlier, and Mr. Burns certainly knows, and Katie, I was sharing a gentleman name, and I would encourage the West Michigan Historical Society to look this up. And it was something for me in the early 2000s that helped me on this journey to understand that there are people in West Michigan and stories in West Michigan that must be told. And it fits into this sort of fellow traveler context. And it's the abolitionist movement itself. And you know, if you think about what was happening in Southwest Michigan, particularly with the abolitionist movement and the Quakers and such, and those who were harboring, if you will, people who had escaped slavery in the South, we have two of the most significant abolitionists that the world has ever seen. One is buried in Muskegon and one is buried in Battle Creek. And so for me, as I think about Captain Jonathan Walker, the man with the branded hand, look him up. One of the most incredible stories that you'd ever want to read about. A hero connected to Frederick Douglass and the great abolitionists of that time, buried in Muskegon, settled in Muskegon. He's the only man, I believe maybe the second, to be branded by the U.S. government with the letters SS on his hand for slave stealer. He was caught moving slaves from the south to the north. He was a captain of a ship. And then obviously we know Sojourner Truth in her story. And so for me, again, being curious and then understanding, we talk about migration, and it didn't just start during the 20s or during the 40s. We know that people were escaping slavery and harsh conditions in the South. Why did Jonathan Walker end up in Muskegon and Sojourner Truth end up in Battle Creek? Why did they settle there? There was something, anyway, I'll just go on. Fellow travelers, I think the abolitionists, and we have this abolitionist spirit in Grand Rapids, within West Michigan, and we think that these stories that you're preserving, stories that we're telling is gonna help people be more proud about being or having that abolitionist spirit.
That's good.
Thank you. We have some more questions. We have time for some more.
For 35 years now, the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council has been proving that most conventional, or the city, state, and Michigan histories have not done an adequate job featuring their women. And right now, one of my colleagues, Sophia Ward Brewer, is looking directly at civil rights history, and in particular, identifying women who were not visible, who were not vocal on stages, but who were doing all the work behind the scenes and have not been credited. And we've also done a great amount of work in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and discovered women who, like Emma Ford in Grand Rapids, was big in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, speaking all over the nation. Another woman named Mary Roberts Tate, similar kinds of things. These women appear in newspapers, but they haven't appeared in our city histories. So I wondered whether in your project and in your projects, you've gone beyond the ordinary, taking any measures to be sure you're finding the women who should be in there.
No, I'll start. Sophia Ward Brewer is someone that we interviewed for our film, and we had an incredible shoot. I hope I'm not revealing too much, whereby you would all still want to see the film. We had an incredible shoot with her at the Grand Rapids Study Club, the Grand Rapids Women's Study Club. It's going to be incredible, the stories that she tells, but that's an under-promoted asset to our community. The Grand Rapids Women's Study Club is the critical part of our book. It's a critical story in our film. There's other. Helen Clater has an incredible story, first African-American female president of the YWCA. So both the study club and Helen Clater stands out. Hillary Bissell, if you know that story, Hillary Bissell. You did what?
I played Hillary Bissell in the NAACP 100th anniversary.
Oh, in that film? I mean, with the recording that they put up? Incredible. Incredible. Then no, this is, Hillary Bissell is an incredible organizer. I'll just say that for us in our film, we think, and I know I promote this, I'd rather see more and hear and feel more Hillary Bissells than Hillary Clinton's. That speaks to what a white ally should be for the black community, that she was a model of an ally in terms of the way that she supported establishing the NAACP, her communications with W.E.B. Du Bois regularly. She was a strong voice, maybe arguably as a white female, particularly one of the strongest voices I've ever read about or experienced. And so, folks talk about her in our documentary as well, but we absolutely lift up women in that struggle. Lastly, I'd be remiss to not mention the unique thing about Todd's book when we talk about the Black freedom struggle is that Todd lifts up stories of Black people overcoming this system. And so even with some of the people that I mentioned, and the data may not work itself out, it won't be for the lack of effort. It won't be for the lack of faith and ingenuity and commitment to community. To that point of the Grand Rapids Study Club, this is a group of maids who were cleaning homes here for the well-to-do, if you will, and met monthly in an organized way and brought some of the greater voices and speakers and musicians that were nationally known here into town. And many of them supported their husbands, if you will, who were voices within the civil rights struggle in Grand Rapids. And so our documentary absolutely speaks to the tremendous impact that women in Grand Rapids have had, absolutely.
So for decades, National Register listings did not include women's names for decades. We've made a fairly strict, unless it's really truly impossible to figure out, we've made a pretty strict rule of you have to tell us. and it has to be in the title. You have to tell us about who she was because she matters too. And sometimes that can be hard for researchers because if they aren't well known and they didn't show up in the newspapers, census records maybe, or city directories may be all we have. So it can be challenging sometimes, but we are definitely trying. We have not applied for any of the History of Equal Rights grants. That's the National Park Service grants that look at women's history. But the City of Detroit just successfully got a grant for the Women's Club. I'm going to blank on which. It was included in our civil rights survey, and I'm blanking on the name of it right this second. But they just in January, I believe, got awarded a grant to be able to amend the National Register nomination for that to include more of the women's history side of things. So I think there's kind of slow movement towards that. It's definitely something that we're interested in. It's just, again, that limited capacity thing.
Okay. I think we have time still for maybe one or two more questions at the most. I don't know if anybody has anything they're burning to ask or comment. I, of course, have my own questions that I could ask as the moderator.
I'd be interested in hearing from the audience, though, for those who, if it's okay, is that okay?
Sure.
For those who, again, have gotten into those stories in Todd's book, in the book that we're making the movie about, what are some of the stories that stand out to you? We've done this as an exercise since, the development of our film, and I would just say there's so many favorites for me, but the Keith Theater story with Emmett Bolden, which was a precursor to the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, 30 years before Brown versus Board of Education, is one of my one of my favorites. Anybody have any sort of favorites? I'd love to hear. Yep.
Well, it's just a small piece in Todd's books, but I thought it was really interesting that the Women's Study Club pulled their resources and invested in Idlewild. And they made enough profit because the prices in Idlewild were going up so much that it really made a difference in establishing that study group.
No, thank you for that. I love that story. The house is at 427 James, and that's, again, where we shot Sophia, and the fact that they were that ahead of the norm to, what do you call it, prospect a sale in that way and then come down and buy that house in the, 30s or, when they bought that home, or 40s, or I don't know, I won't forget when they bought it, but incredible. I love that story. Thank you.
I don't think Todd's book gets around to mentioning, or goes before some of that. In 1906, there were 5 different African-American women's clubs who sponsored in Grand Rapids the state Colored Women's Clubs conference.
Okay.
And if you're familiar with first wave, second wave feminism, these women would have been part of the first wave that got suffrage pushed through and all kinds of other things. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. We discovered them in the newspapers.
Incredible. Thank you for that. Absolutely.
Thank you. Any last questions? All right. I just have one that I thought maybe you could each talk about to sort of close us out. And it's always interesting to hear about all the projects that people are doing. And I think, we're all looking forward to seeing the film and the shorts and the other things that you're going to produce, and finding out about the places that have been preserved and the stories that you're going to uncover there. But I think there's so much of local history, that still could be promoted and more widely known. And so I'm wondering if any of you have, sort of idea that you haven't been able to pursue. We have some young people, some students here in the audience, and I got to be honest with you, if you're a student and you want to hear more about a particular story from West Michigan, you're one of the most likely people to tell that story in the future. And so, I don't want to give you an assignment here if you're a student, but I am a professor, so, so that's something that I was wondering, if you had infinite time and money, if you had a person who was ready just to start working on something, is there something out there that you're not currently working on that you think is just begging to be told?
We have a giant list of our kind of wish list projects in my office.
What's your favorite one?
I don't know if I could pick one. The one I'm trying to work on making happen is a statewide survey of multifamily public housing. We actually had funding for it a couple of years ago, and then we got transferred to a different department, and that disappeared. But that's probably one of my, we've gotten to the point where a lot of those are reaching the age where we have to start taking them into account, and there's a huge part of that that's also wrapped into the civil rights story, and I think that there's a lot of stories there that we don't know yet. There's too many to name at this point. We have dozens of project ideas, small and large. So anybody is always welcome to come chat with us, and we just add to them constantly because there's never enough money to do all the projects that we want to do. So.
I don't know if I have a specific one, but what I think about most is just, in the time I've been in local government there, I worked with the first African-American mayor, first African-American female mayor. Our city also had a female mayor, I think back in the 30s or 40s. And I'm thinking somewhere before I'm all done with this, I want to kind of tie in the transition of our local government with the bigger context of African-American history, and sort of pull the two together. I think it's ever been done in one place. So I'm thinking that's one of the things I want to do with the time I got left.
That question just makes me think back to a time that we were doing some research, and we were in main library, Grand Rapids Public Library downtown. And as a kid, I just remember I was with probably a library rat. I used to love going to the library and just spending my Saturdays with a couple of my friends. So I just love libraries anyway. And so we were there with Dr. Jelks, and he was guiding us through some research. And so what stands out for me in that way is that we have 2 African-American men, not from Grand Rapids, who came into Grand Rapids, spent time in our public library, and produced 2 books from 2 different periods of time. Todd is actually writing another book right now. So Randall was standing there watching Jasmine, Vic and I, and Kim, and some others who were doing some research, and he was just sitting back, and he had this big smile on his face. And you know, and he was looking at us. We were just, again, rabbit trailing, and we're all over the place, and we're looking at all of the resources that the library has, and we're like, wow, we didn't know this. Oh, and this is connected to this. And he's just kind of standing back. He says that Grand Rapids has an embarrassment of riches as it relates to stories. And that is the absolute truth. And so for us to answer that question, we're trying to put an institution together so that young people can see that we will be successful in telling our stories. And we're going to change Grand Rapids. That's our intent, by getting our stories out there. And it's really important. But we're going to open up, we think, we hope for, we're prayerful about a floodgate of stories. We have so many incredible stories. Lastly, we can't, that's why we're doing vignettes, because we can't tell all these incredible stories in a 90-minute film. We did a poster project that, you know, you can visit grandstandpictures.com and get more information, where we have 27 individuals that we've done posters about. That is, we've done it since Black History Month. They're all available. We can't talk about the 27 people that we pick up. There's 60 people in Todd's book. Each of them are deserving of a story. You know, again, that's why I want to ask the question about the favorites. I'm trying to figure out, like, how best. The South High story, the Hillary Bissell, the, you know, Keith Theater. Those are just in the book. You know, the funny thing to me is about how Black people and white people in Grand Rapids deal with this book. And to me, this has been a response. Folks are passionate about the book, and I think the white community more so, in ways, because to them, I get this idea that it's a wow. Oh, that's how racism is upheld in Grand Rapids. That's how redlining took place in Grand Rapids. And it's kind of an eye-opener. You know, a lot of Blacks who we've engaged with the content, although are interested certainly in the history and the content, they'll say, that's not all of the stories. You've missed stories. So that in and of itself is amazing. Lastly, the idea that Dr. Delia Fernandez, again, has done research and has produced the first, as I'm understanding, book about the Latinx journey in Grand Rapids is incredible. Now it's part of the canon. We expect that we'll see more stories, and that Dr. Fernandez and Jones's efforts are going to inspire, that our efforts are going to inspire, that you as historians and people who are advocate about, passionate about your community, that you are going to inspire young people. So let's hope for that. Let's hope that our stories, your stories, are going to be relevant enough and be able to inspire these other generations to pick up the mantle and to continue to tell stories.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's a great note to end on. So I would love everybody to please give our panelists a round of applause and thank them.